In the winter of 1886, a French archaeological team digging through a necropolis in Upper Egypt uncovered a small, sealed grave. Inside, resting against the remains of an ancient monk, was a manuscript that had not seen the light of day for nearly 2,000 years. It was a detailed, horrific, and highly controversial eyewitness account of the afterlife. A text so deeply unsettling that the early Christian church systematically scrubbed it from its canonical history, leaving the revelation of John as the sole accepted vision of the end of the world. For centuries, theologians assumed the Apocalypse of Peter was lost forever. But the truth is much deeper. Today, we are going to explore the very first Christian text to map out the topography of hell. We will examine the terrifying visions that would eventually inspire Dante's Inferno, and the profound theological debate behind why an emerging church erased it from its history. Written between the years 120 and 150 AD, the Apocalypse of Peter did not deal in abstract prophecies or the vague, symbolic warnings found in canonical texts. It was a visceral, unflinching, and intensely physical tour of eternal damnation. This manuscript operated on a brutal and unyielding logic known as lex talionis, the law of retaliation. In Peter's vision of hell, the punishment was designed to perfectly and agonizingly mirror the sin. As Peter is guided through this dark abyss by Jesus, he witnesses a landscape of horror that defies comprehension. The text describes a great lake composed entirely of flaming mire, where the wicked are systematically tortured. He sees blasphemers suspended over roaring, unquenchable fires by the very tongues they use to curse the divine. He watches liars and false witnesses, whose lips and tongues are brutally sliced away, condemned to an eternity of chewing on fire. The manuscript spares no detail, categorizing the damned by their earthly transgressions. Men and women who committed adultery are hanged by their hair or their loins over a bubbling pit of boiling mire. Women who procured abortions are buried up to their necks in a lake of excrement and gore. In a horrifying twist of poetic justice, the spirits of their unborn children are placed on a precipice opposite them, shooting literal rays of fire from their eyes to blind their mothers for eternity. Those who hoarded their wealth and callously ignored the poor are stripped of their earthly finery. They are forced to wear filthy, tattered rags, walking barefoot back and forth across an endless expanse of jagged, red-hot stones and sharp gravel. The text describes the fate of murderers. They are cast into a lightless pit, teeming with venomous reptiles and flesh-eating worms, but their true torment is psychological. Standing at the edge of the pit, illuminated by the flames below, are the souls of their innocent victims. The victims watch as their murderers suffer, singing hymns that praise the unyielding justice of the divine. But perhaps the most terrifying element of Peter's hell is who exactly is carrying out these tortures. They are not demons or the fallen angels of modern tradition. Overseeing this eternal suffering are the angels of punishment. The text describes them not as spiritual beings, but as cold, almost biomechanical administrators of pain. They are terrifying, merciless entities, wearing garments darker than the night sky. Wielding heavy iron chains of fire, they function as the living physical apparatus of the underworld itself. But the Apocalypse of Peter is not entirely consumed by darkness. To fully comprehend the depth of the damnation, the text suggests one must understand the absolute perfection of the reward. Jesus takes Peter away from the abyss and leads him to a holy mountain to witness the realm of the righteous. It is described as a vast, great country, entirely outside the bounds of our physical world. It is the Christian equivalent of the Elysian fields. There is no sun in this realm, because none is needed. The entire landscape is exceedingly bright, illuminated directly by the blinding, radiant glory of the divine. It is a place of eternal spring, blooming with unfading flowers, incorruptible plants, and towering trees heavy with blessed, fragrant fruit. The text notes that the air itself is thick, heavy with the sweet perfume of spices that drift on the wind. The inhabitants of this paradise are physically transformed by their environment. The righteous are clad in the raiment of shining angels. Their very skin and clothing emit a blinding light, that matches the brilliance of the realm around them. There are no hierarchies here, no suffering, and no exhaustion. They live in absolute harmony, spending eternity singing hymns of praise in a perfect unified chorus with the heavenly host. But if this text provided such a complete and vivid picture of the afterlife, why isn't it in the Bible today? We have to go back to the early days of Christianity. In the 2nd century, Christianity lacked a finalized biblical canon or a globally recognized hierarchical clergy. The early church was a fractured, underground network of believers, constantly under the threat of Roman persecution. In that terrifying environment, isolated congregations relied heavily on smuggled scrolls and violent apocalyptic visions to keep their faith alive. This made the Apocalypse of Peter massively popular, as it promised them that their persecutors would receive exact justice. In fact, if we look at the Muratorian fragment, the oldest surviving list of canonical books in the Roman Church, dated around 170 AD, the Apocalypse of Peter is explicitly listed right alongside the Revelation of John. For generations, it was considered divine scripture, but the Muratorian fragment also captures a fascinating real-time controversy. The author of the list adds a massive trigger warning to the text, noting, "We accept the Apocalypse of John and also the Apocalypse of Peter, although some of us do not want the latter to be read publicly in the church." There was a theological war brewing. The vivid, horrific violence of Peter's hell was becoming a severe embarrassment to the early church, so much so that pagan philosophers began using the book as a weapon to mock Christians. In the late 3rd century, a prominent anti-Christian philosopher named Porphyry publicly ridiculed the church over the absurdity of Peter's gruesome punishments. It became such a PR disaster that a Christian bishop named Macarius Magnus had to write a furious, multi-volume defense book called the Apocryticus. The church found itself constantly defending a book that was too violent, too graphic, and too heavily influenced by pagan mythology. By the 4th century, the historian Eusebius formally labeled it spurious. When examining why the Apocalypse of Peter was ultimately buried, modern historians are deeply divided. On one hand, many Orthodox scholars argue that the reasoning was simple. It lacked apostolic authority. The early church eventually realized that the apostle Peter likely did not write the text himself, that it was penned by an anonymous Christian in Egypt. But on the other side of the debate, a growing number of historians point to a deeper theological motive. They argue the lack of authorship was just a convenient excuse. They believe the true reason the text was systematically destroyed comes down to the heresy of universalism. When the Akhmim Codex was discovered in the Egyptian monk's grave in 1886, scholars translated it and found a brutal but standard vision of eternal hell. But decades later, archaeologists uncovered another piece of the puzzle, a tiny 3rd century papyrus known as the Rayner fragment. And what the Rayner fragment revealed completely upended the theological narrative. It proved that the Akhmim Codex had been deliberately tampered with. The Rayner fragment preserves the original ending of the book, an ending that early scribes had explicitly deleted. In the original ending, a radical theological concept is introduced. When Peter and the apostles witness the horrifying, agonizing suffering of the damned, they cannot stomach it. They break down in tears, weeping and begging Christ to have mercy on the tortured souls. And, moved by their desperate pleas, Christ actually agrees. He reverses his judgment. He pulls the damned from the fire and washes them in the Echerusian lake, a concept stolen directly from Greek mythology. This lake literally washes away eternal damnation, allowing souls to transition from hell into grace. Early rebel Christians fiercely defended this mercy clause, even quoting the Apostle Paul's own letters to the Romans to prove that God's mercy would eventually triumph over judgment. But this theological loophole was the absolute nail in the coffin for the Apocalypse of Peter. The early church was emerging as a powerful, structured institution, and its ultimate authority relied heavily on the doctrine of final, permanent judgment. The church simply could not canonize a book that suggested hell might have an exit door. If damnation were not permanent, the fear that kept the empire in line would evaporate. Today, historians continue to debate why the revelation of John survived the canonical cuts while Peter's was discarded. Some scholars point to the radical difference in their messaging. They argue that while Peter's apocalypse focused on gruesome individual torture and personal sins, John's revelation offered a grand cosmic epic about God destroying corrupt earthly empires like Rome. To a persecuted church, they argue, John's revelation provided a unifying political message of cosmic justice. Other theologians believe the rejection was purely structural. They argue that Peter's deeply personal, visually grotesque, and ultimately forgiving tour of hell did not fit the theology of an emerging, organized church, an institution whose authority increasingly relied on the strict doctrine of final, permanent judgment. Yet, despite its deliberate suppression, the theological footprint of the Apocalypse of Peter never truly vanished. Over a millennium later, when Dante Alighieri composed his masterpiece, the Inferno, he anchored it in the same framework of poetic justice, the lex talionis, that the Apocalypse of Peter documented centuries before. Dante's iconic vision of hell is, in many ways, simply an echo of a forgotten text he had likely never even read, which leads to a fascinating realization. The physical landscape of hell, ironic punishments, and specific tortures that many still picture today closely mirrors a book that the early church ultimately chose to leave behind. In our next video, we open the official text to explore a chapter that has haunted theologians for centuries: a desperate king, a forbidden ritual, and the Witch of Endor. Subscribe so you don't miss it.